for your time today. I do always appreciate people taking time out of their schedules to attend these webinars. So getting, as Steven said, getting from 0 to 10 million, how to build your RevOps MVP and ensure efficient growth. Before we get started, I just wanted to share that what we talk about today doesn't automatically mean that you will grow efficiently. Rather, it's not a silver bullet, if you will, to growing efficiently. And it should be noted that, especially earlier on, you will be wildly inefficient. You should be wildly inefficient, testing things and trying things. And so, what we'll talk about today, and the insights that I'll share, the advice that I'll share, it should put you in a position to understand and define what those dials, what those levers are, but as and when you need to change them or dial them back or to optimize your processes or drive efficiency, if you will, you'll have the baseline sort of visibility and understanding of how to actually do that, right? So this is, I deliberately didn't want to use the word foundational because I used it last time, but it essentially is foundational because, again, we're talking about that 0 to 10 million stage. And so I do have a tendency to speak quickly, so I promise you I'll try to slow it down. If you didn't catch anything, we're a small group, so just feel free to give me a shout, and I'm happy to drill into anything you might want to or to explain something. As mentioned in the blurb that was shared about the webinar, we will try to leave some time for Q&A at the end. But as I mentioned a second ago, feel free to ask questions during the presentation. So with that out of the way, just a quick intro for myself. So as Steven said, RevOps expert at Notion. I've been doing that for almost a year now, which has flown by. In parallel to that, I run an independent RevOps consultancy, which I've been doing for just over 3 years. And prior to that, I worked in 2 London-based startups building RevOps functions. One at Fidel API, where I was for a few years, about 3 years. Another one called on Fido, which you may have heard of, which I was at for about 2 years. And then prior to that, various startups in the US and Europe for about a decade. And maybe most notably that you may have heard of is a company called Trustpilot out of Copenhagen. But I think the main takeaway really is that I've spent the majority of my career in these early stage businesses. I love building the machine versus operating the machine. And so hopefully that comes through in some of the information I'll share with you today. So what will you get out of today's session? Really, really simple, right? It's a blueprint. It's one thing. Spoiler alert, right? It's one thing. It's blueprint and practical advice for building your RevOps MVP and obviously driving that efficient growth as and when you need to. And so why 10 million? What is this sort of thing about 10 million? And so there was an analysis done by Notion and a guy called Kyle Hoyer. I always mispronounce his name. A couple of years ago, you may have seen him on LinkedIn. And if you don't know who he is I quote, like a heavy hitter within like the VC startup world. He has amazing content, which he writes on the Substack called Growth Unhinged, but he also then shares it on LinkedIn. And so I encourage you all to have a look. But basically what Kyle said was, between the space of 2.5 and 10 million ARR, it is an underappreciated, you can see on the screen, stumbling block. And the main reason for that is he said that companies struggle to nail that transition from founder-led to something more structured. And again, you can see the highlighted, the 3 callouts he had was they're either going after his suspicion, I should say, is they're either going after the wrong target customer, they're trying to deploy the wrong playbook, or they've got the wrong team to not understand if A and B are right in the first place. And so to illustrate that point even further, so Notion did an analysis. I can't remember when this was, a couple of years ago, but they basically looked at 14,000 startups who had raised 3 million in venture capital or greater, going all the way back to 2005. And so of those 14,000 startups, only 40%, right, 4 in 10, have made it past that 10 million ARR barrier. And so why is that, right? What's so special, as I said before, about that 10 million barrier? And so I think it has to do with the fundamental difference between growing and scaling. And I actually presented this slide, I think it was in 2019, but I think it still rings true today, and it certainly rings true to this discussion today. And so the fundamental difference is that growing can be and is accidental, whereas scaling is intentional. And so on growing on the accidental side, you might be in the right market, you might have the right timing, and you might have a product that's good enough or even great, and you have these tailwinds that can take you to 10 million and even go much, much past 10 million. And the kind of ridiculous example I thought of for this discussion is OpenAI, right? I doubt they had all their processes and all their sort of systems in place to scale to where they are today. But like I said, it can be accidental. Growth can be accidental, I should say. And then scaling, on the other hand, is more intentional, right? So yes, you may be experiencing those same tailwinds, but the fundamental difference, again, to me in RevOps is that you're more methodical in your approach, right? You're more methodical in your execution. And so you know which inputs drive which outputs, and you treat that go-to-market organization or engine like a machine. And so that brings the now famous bow tie model by winning by design, which Notion has a partnership with. Um, but what I wanted to call out here was that I've put a sort of RevOps overlay across this. And so on the left-hand side, you see the green boxes, which are ICP, target personas, target accounts, target segments, and then the qualification framework you use to qualify against those things. And the way I classify those green boxes effectively is how you orientate your go-to-market. Where should sales go? Where should marketing go? How should SDRs be thinking about creating their list? And so on and so forth. And so green is all about the orientation of go-to-market, but then the blue, the top to bottom, are really those boxes are how you operationalize your go-to-market engine. And so, it's important to note here that none of these things are one and done, right? They shouldn't be one and done, but put it that way. As the business changes and morphs, you will need to adjust all of these things here. But the ultimate goal really is to create an environment where you can monitor and make changes as needed and put yourselves in a position to continuously improve, right? So as I said before, you may not be ready to kind of turn up the efficiency dial, but at least you have the building blocks in place to be able to do that as and when you need to. You have to cut costs, you have to, I don't know, improve your conversion rate, whatever it might be. I see time and again where businesses don't have that visibility, then it is a Herculean effort in addressing some of the operational debt that they should have addressed actually earlier on. So again, it's about putting yourselves in the position to continuously improve. And so, what are the steps to building that MVP? So, this is how I think about RevOps MVP. There might be different definitions of it, but what are those steps? So the first thing, as I mentioned a minute ago, so creating focus for your go-to-market organization. The next is establishing your data model. That's taking a page out of Winning by Design. Third thing is codifying your qualification framework. Fourth is designing and implementing your MVP go-to-market processes. That's a mouthful, but I want to emphasize MVP on that, which we'll talk about in a second. And really, it's about, again, early stage. You need to test your go-to-market model. What's working, what's not working, how do we pivot, that sort of thing, or if we need to pivot, that sort of thing. And then lastly, it's measuring, analyzing, surfacing, and improving on the 1 through 4, basically, in that list. And so, we'll spend the next sort of 45-ish minutes diving into these topics. And my goal today is for you to have this information as a blueprint and then take it away to your respective businesses and do what you need to do to build your RevOps MVP. That's my goal for today, I should say. So with that, the first up is defining your ICP and your target personas. And so how I try to frame this is sharing kind of it's practical advice, it's conversational advice, but they are principles that I think are worth highlighting based on my experience of working with these early stage businesses. So it's not all encompassing, but hopefully this gets your mind thinking how you should be doing these sorts of initiatives like defining your ICP and target persona. And the next sort of 5 or 6 slides, the next steps all follow the same format. But the first one worth mentioning is and maybe you've heard this before, but the ICP definition should be uncomfortably narrow. And I love that phrase, uncomfortably narrow. And I do attribute it to Stephen. He said it to me about a year ago, and it's really stuck with me. But there's a quote that I heard a couple months ago saying, "A startup is more likely to die from indigestion than they are of starvation." And so this is really about focusing the efforts of your go-to-market organization, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. Next up is that your definition will be dynamic, right? That will change over time. When you launch new products or new features to those products, or you launch new geos, or there are other things that unlock aspects of that ICP, it's going to change over time, right? So it's not a static thing; it's a dynamic thing that you can unlock and expand as the business matures. Third thing is that sophistication of the ICP, and that should improve over time. Again, it's not one and done. So what I mean by that, and again, this is not a scientific classification, this is how I think about it, but the level 1 definition of ICP is your best guess, right? Every business goes through that. That's where everybody starts, unless they don't define their ICP, which is another problem. But you start off with your best guess ICP, and that's based on external attributes, industry, geo, whatever that might be, as well as some assumptions, right? And that might be a little bit easier if you're verticalized, right, where you have a vertical that you sell to. But by and large, that's kind of how you define your level one. Level two then is really layering in attributes of your happy or paying customers and their behavior. So you've got some customers, they're using your product, you analyze what they're doing, you work that back upstream to mature your ICP definition. Then the third thing here is that this is the point where you're layering in your unit economics, right? So your LTV over CAC, your CAC payback, you're basically trying to orientate your ICP and your go-to-market initiatives to into your most profitable customers. That's how I think about the different levels of ICP. Then lastly, as this ICP evolves, keep sense checking that against your addressable market, right? Again, as that ICP grows, you're going to have more and more TAM to go after, more and more, again, addressable market to go after. So that's important for a couple of reasons. One, investors love that, right? They love to know that you're on top of that information, and you can then communicate the potential opportunity you've got, so that can help with fundraising and various other things. And then two, it also allows you to further build out your target account list internally, right? So there's it goes a long way in operationalizing your again, I keep saying go-to-market efforts, but it rings true here. So how should you define that ICP? So this, I cheated a little bit on this slide. It's the anatomy of ICP and target persona. I kind of combined everything together, but I think it's relevant. So the first thing here is the right company. Second is the right persona or personas. Third is the right product or service. And fourth are the right behaviors or the right intent. And so, just to call a few of these things out, right? On the company level, that's usually publicly available information, but firmographic information, technographic information, maybe there's localization, language, that sort of thing that pertains to what you do. Right personas, right? Things like demographic, psychographic attributes, understanding the difference I should say, between buyer, user, and champion, right? They're fundamentally different people within that buying team. What makes them tick, right? What jobs do they do? What's a day in the life? What are their challenges and pain points? Because you're not selling just to a company, you're selling to the people as well. So it's important to know that. The right product and service. I mean, this is a big one, right? If there's no fit for product or service, then it should never even be in the pipeline to begin with, right? So understanding their technical compatibility, any sort of regulatory or compliance needs, and even commercial viability, right? Are the economics such that this makes sense or not, right? And then the last thing is behaviors or intent, which is again equally important if you want to apply weighting to it. So interest in proceeding the conversation and any sort of compelling events identified. So regulatory compliance events or year ends, these sorts of things. And so what I recommend when you're going through this exercise is structuring it like this, structure it by these buckets, and then put everything out onto the table, all the attributes out on the table that you think are relevant to your ICP and your target personas, and then you can debate, discuss, and prioritize from there. So next up is identifying your target accounts and your target segments. So it's 1B because they're kind of linked. The first principle I wanted to share, and it kind of goes without saying, but use that ICP to drive that exercise. You create your list of target accounts that match your ICP, and then devise your acquisition strategy from there. Is this a marketing thing? Is this a brute force sales thing? Is this something else, right? Next up is, when you're defining these target segments, go granular, right? Sometimes industry is just too broad. And so sub-industry or vertical or use case. And I wanted to share an example because I think it's relevant to this. So there was a company I worked with in the past where they were going after retail companies. So their ICP definition was retail, which, okay, yeah, fine. We want to go after retail companies. But two companies on that retail list that were in the territories of the sales reps were, one was HelloFresh, which is like food delivery. One was Tesco, right? From the third party data source, they both said that they're retail, but one is, as I said, food delivery, and one is grocery. And so fundamentally, they're different companies, fundamentally different value props, which ultimately means your messaging to them and how you approach them and what how you qualify them is fundamentally different, right? So sometimes industry is too broad. Go granular when you can, and if it makes sense. Third thing is using technology to build these lists. Again, pretty basic stuff here, but tools like GoodFit, for example, will not just help you to automate that process, but will also help you to surface companies that may not otherwise have been in your view. Next up is, tiering and prioritization of your account list is super important. Again, you might have, especially if you have a horizontal sort of, your market's horizontal, you might have 1,000, people within your TAM or within your addressable, or who you think are in your addressable market or obtainable market rather. So tiering is super important. And so again, it's about focus and it's about understanding what is good and what is best. Like what are the differences between those, and then focusing those efforts on the highest priority accounts. And then lastly, revisit this regularly, right? So, you will create this at the beginning of Q1. You will then, go to market in Q1, and then you're going to have some learnings right afterwards. And so this worked, this didn't, but share those thoughts, share those feedback, and update that on a quarterly basis. I would suggest sometimes monthly, but generally speaking, quarterly. So then, okay, step 2 then is establishing your data model. And so first principle I wanted to share is that this is, I mentioned this before, but it's foundational to your go-to market, right? This data model is, it's the foundation on which your entire go-to market will be built. Your processes, your systems, your metrics, your reporting, think of it like your spine, right? Everything is kind of orientated around this. And it's critical to aligning your entire go-to market org, which I'll talk about in a few moments. The next thing, and I share this with every single client I work with, it's mission critical to align your data model, to align your sales process, align everything to how your buyers buy. You shouldn't be doing it in a vacuum. It should be based on how your buyers buy. You need to meet your customers where they are. And so that data model should mirror how your customers buy your product and service. Again, we can talk about that in a bit. Third one is designing agnostically and keeping this one-dimensional. And so I guess my word of advice here is don't have tunnel vision and just build this based on one specific segment or one specific motion. Kind of think of it a little bit more holistically than that. And the other thing is keep it linear, not multidimensional. And again, just a real world example I want to share is there was someone I've worked with again in the past where their data model was an amalgamation, their customer lifecycle specifically was an amalgamation of customer lifecycle, sales outcomes, sales process outcomes, as well as their communication status for their outbound, right? So it was an amalgamation of 3 different dimensions. And then the output of that, or the impact of that, I should say, was they could not report on their customer funnel, right? Or if they did, they pulled a bunch of different data sources in Excel and joined them up, and they spent a week doing it before the board, deck was due at the end of the quarter. And so, getting this right, from the start, avoids, the accumulation of operational debt, but also headaches down the line. Sorry, I didn't go through those. The other thing worth calling out here is some architectural considerations, right? So there are architectural considerations, particularly when you map this to a CRM, that you should think about when defining this model. And so things like sales motions, do you have PLG? Do you have channel partners? Do you have both? Do you have direct? Is it a hybrid, right? Thinking about that, considering that before just jumping in willy-nilly is important. Then something else, again, worth calling out is, are you verticalized and therefore have named accounts and therefore care about company level? Or is it more personal level where you're just trying to get leads and putting them through kind of the classic inbound funnel? So again, thinking about that is worthwhile as you go through this process. And then lastly, but not least, this really should only be done once. If you do it properly and you build enough if you build enough leeway or enough sort of wiggle room, you should only really need to do this one time. So revisiting the bow tie once more, again, just to reiterate, framework for recurring revenue, although I do think this is applicable to other models, right? So like usage-based, right? I think that's applicable to that. But the point being here is that you need to go through this exercise of defining your data model. So with that, you'll get your life cycle stages, your MQL, leads, MQLs, et cetera. You'll get your conversion points between them. So you can see the CR1. So that's the conversion from A to B to C to D and so on and so forth. And then lastly, you've got your volumetrics, which is the count of those things, right? That's where you can understand and report on the conversion rates through your funnel. And then once you've got that funnel defined, what comes out the other side, or what should come out the other side, is a very cleanly and clearly defined life cycle stages, definitions, and triggers to then go away and build in your CRM, which obviously needs to be done, but also to align the rest of the business on what this looks like, right? This isn't knowledge in somebody's head or multiple people's heads. There's not misalignment between teams. It is a universally understood and defined definition of what, in this case, life cycle stages and definitions are. So The next up, or step three, is codifying your qualification framework. This one's a big one for me because it often gets overlooked. But first thing, again, first principle is anchor that framework. Again, this is, this isn't rocket science here, but anchor this framework, or your framework rather, around your ICP, around your personas, and around the nuance of your product or service that you're selling. That information, once it's on, the sheet of paper or the whiteboard, wherever it might be, you should use that to then formulate your qualification questions, right? So who are prospects? What do they care about? How do they fit with our product? Get that on the sheet of paper and then formulate your questions from there. Next up is the difference kind of between primary information or attributes and secondary information or attributes, as well as killer questions, right? So of all the kind of attributes or like the pieces of the puzzle you put on the table, what of those is must have versus nice to have, and what might be secondary or contextual that, if we get it, great, but if not, that's okay too. So kind of thinking about it in those terms is really useful. And then the other thing is, what answers are if we get answers back from our qualification, what answers are cause for automatic disqualification, no matter what. You're almost thinking of it like your anti-ICP. And it's important to kind of understand that as you go through this process, or this initiative, I should say. Third thing is, your qualification process should be source agnostic. You shouldn't have different qualification for different sort of sources or different lead origins, if you will. And so that process should be standardized for scalability, which I'll touch on in a second. And then lastly, make sure you're capturing, and I call this out because I've seen instances where businesses don't define their nurture reasons or their disqualification reasons. So they might spend 100 grand, 500 grand, a million pounds to generate leads that then come through the funnel. And then they don't know what they know what's good because that goes to pipeline, but they don't know what's bad. They don't know what's ugly. And there's no sort of, feedback loop that then goes back up to marketing so they can, so I'm looking at the chat right now, so apologies, but they can then reorientate and kind of recalibrate their efforts. So was there a question?
Okay. No, just a couple of comments.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool. Okay. So I want to share again why codifying this qualification framework is so critically important and why I recommend doing it earlier than later. And so, it gets everybody singing from the same hymn sheet, right? It's alignment on what qualification needs to happen. But more importantly than that, or equally important to that, is that if you look at the kind of customer, the stages of the customer funnel on this one, effective qualification tells you if an opportunity is worth pursuing or not, right? So you can get in there, you can qualify in, qualify out with confidence. But on the right-hand side of that effective qualification, as you go through that sales process, it's almost like on overturning stones, right? Where that effective qualification highlights the risks or the challenges or potential challenges to onboarding and activating a customer, right? So unearthing that before customer success gets that information is critically important and helps the overall journey for that customer and helps them to be successful more quickly. And I'm not sure if you guys have experienced this, but oftentimes the ball is dropped at customer onboarding, right? And so this goes a long way in helping to address that. Then the other thing worth calling out with respect to lead qualification and codifying that framework is why standardization is so important. And so, what you see on the screen is aspirational. It's going to take time to achieve this here, but we should be working towards this simplicity. And so, as I mentioned before, there should be a standardized qualification process. Again, no matter if it's inbound, outbound, whatever it might be. Some nuance for sure, but by and large, it's a standardized process. So you get a prospect, it goes through the process, and then you've got basically 4 outcomes. And again, I say this is aspirational because it takes time to get here. First up, you've got ICP, and the timing is right, which means you create an op. Second one is it is ICP and the timing is wrong, and you drop them into a nurture. Now that timing needs to be developed, internally. That's up to how you want to kind of play that. But effectively, you kind of define what does timing look like. Then further on from there, you've got not ICP, but the timing is right. So this is outside of your definition, but maybe they're super keen to have a discussion or even buy your product. That's where you need to make a judgment call on, is this worth it? Will they be successful? Is the juice worth the squeeze, for lack of a better phrase? And so that's needs more qualification. And I'd imagine that whenever you start out, a lot of opportunities and a lot of leads will go to that bucket, but that should sort of dwindle over time. And then last but not least, not ICP, tell me wrong, you just get rid of it, qualification. And so really the takeaway here is that you're empowering your sales development people and your salespeople to own this process themselves. Sometimes I see placeholder stages, for example, in the sales funnel that is SQL approval stage, for example, which it's an unnecessary thing if you empower your salespeople to own this process themselves. So step 4 of 6 is designing rather your go-to-market processes. And so my definition of foundational processes include there's lead management and qualification, which we just touched on. There's the sales process, then there's the customer handover and onboarding, or the right-hand side of the bow tie, the life cycle. And the reason why I classify these as foundational is that your business doesn't operate without these, right? They're probably happening today. Maybe they're offline, maybe they're a bit off online, maybe they're disparate, but by and large, these need to happen in order for you to sell into service customers. So that's why I classify those as foundational. The next thing is when you're building these processes, when you're defining these processes, I should say, allow for iteration. If done well, the stages of these processes should not really ever change, right? Your buyer buys in a certain way. The sales process should be, certain stages based on your product. That shouldn't really change. What changes, that's the horizontal part. What changes is what happens in between. What are the activities? What are the qualification gates? How do we improve on those, right? Do we need to add a meeting here or remove a meeting there? It's all about what happens within those stages. So again, if done well, the stages should, like I said, future-proof in the slide for the future, I should say. I just mentioned that. So a couple things, and lastly, what to avoid when you're defining these processes. So this is universal across lead management, across sales process, and especially across your customer, your post-sale customer lifecycle. And so first thing is please do not over-engineer or over-invest. This is why I emphasized MVP at the beginning. Don't over-engineer your process, don't over-invest in tooling, and don't automate for automation's sake, because things will change and you'll have to walk that back, and that will be expensive. And that's under the umbrella of operational debt, the phrase I love to use so much. The next one is, do not buy a tool without defining the process first or understanding the process first. And a classic example of this is ABM. I've seen half a dozen times where businesses will invest 20K, 30K, 50K in an ABM tool, but they don't have an ABM strategy. Not only that, but the data is in such a state that they'll never be able to maximize value out of that tool because the data integrity is so low. So please don't buy that tool without really understanding your requirements, but also defining the process first. And then lastly, do not define your processes in a vacuum, right? So think holistically, work through how that impacts downstream, but also how further up the funnel and upstream it might have an impact on that particular process. So back to winning by design, but this time, and sorry, just one last point on this one. So it's really about setting yourselves up for constant testing and iteration, because again, within this stage, things will change, things will fail, things will succeed. And it's just about understanding what's happening there and like giving yourselves the information to make the best decisions. So next up here is again, back to winning by design. And this time it's their go-to-market model. And so a very quick explainer, you can see along like the x-axis along the top, you've got no touch, low touch, you've got medium touch, and they correspond to deal value, which is on like the bottom part there, 5K, 15K, so on and so forth. And so really this is about how much resource or how much investment should we be making based on ACV. So, do we want to put, I don't know, do we want to put an SDR process in place for a 5K deal? Probably not, right? And so this just gives you a little bit of guidance on how to think about setting up your go-to-market model. And again, you may have found traction on one of these, maybe you found traction on a couple, you may be testing others. But again, the point I want to illustrate is that as you go through this journey of testing and iterating, having those MVP processes in place, those baseline processes in place, will allow you to measure your progress, analyze, iterate, and so on and so forth. So this is an old slide actually that I present, but I think it's worthwhile within the context of this discussion. So once you've got those foundational processes defined and configured in your CRM, HubSpot, Salesforce, Attio, whatever, it doesn't matter. This is a visual interplay between those processes. And so on the left-hand side, you've got the lifecycle stage. In the middle, you've got the lead status or your lead qualification. The blue is the deal stage or your sales process. And on the right-hand side is your customer status or that kind of in-life post-sale right-hand side of the bow tie process. And so Each function here lives within their respective areas. You've got SDRs, for example, in the lead qualification. You've got sales in the deal stages, the sales process, and you've got CS living in the customer status side of things. But the takeaway here is that all of these things are intertwined, number one, and they all roll up into the life cycle stage, right? So this is why it's so important to methodically go through and map out the life cycle stage, map out your data model, understand, for example, on the lead stage, what should our qualification process look like? Just to call something out here. So that working stage, right? Any time I build this for clients or help to build this with clients, that working stage might be 30 days long, right? You might have an integration with SalesLoft or Apollo or some other sort of sales engagement tool where once that status hits new, it gets pinged over to that system, and then your SDRs, your salespeople, then work that through sequencing or however you have it set up for 30 days, right? And then you can come back and say, for example, qualify them or nurture them and disqualify them based on the outcomes of whatever that situation was. And so again, the takeaway here is that they're all intertwined and they should all be developed with consideration. I did also want to mention that I have included a couple of screenshots of templates that I've used in the appendix. So if you're interested in downloading this, it will be provided on the Notion website, but some templates to basically figure out how to go through and define what these processes are. And finally, step 6. So measuring, analyzing, improving your performance. So it's all well and good that you've defined your processes and you've configured them to your tech stack, but now what, right? And so for me, and a lot of businesses do that, right? They get this in place, but then they don't actually use the data that they need to kind of use to drive their business. And so, excuse me, it's about really bringing this data to life. And so there's a couple of different recommendations. I didn't animate this because I thought it would just be useful to have a look at all of the 5 things on the list. But basically, a couple of different ways to bring this data to life. So, the kind of obvious thing is through reports and dashboards, right? You've got the processes in place. You've spent the time doing that. So build some reports and dashboards to, again, bring this to life and to enable your go-to-market organization to self-serve and understand what's happening with the business. Which for me, I think more importantly is establishing a RevOps operating and reporting cadence, even in the absence of a RevOps person, right? So that is getting in the habit of using data to drive your pipeline meetings, to drive your deal reviews, to drive your forecast meetings, right? That is creating, for example, a steering meeting that all the go-to-market leads are included in, that you use this data to surface, you surface this data in that meeting to hold the various individuals accountable, but also to drive the discussion. And so creating that regular touch point, whether it's owned by a dedicated RevOps or not, sometimes it can be finance, sometimes it could be even a VP of sales or something like that, but creating that regular touch point where these insights are surfaced is mission critical as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not sure if you've seen this on LinkedIn, but there's a kind of a how does RevOps become more strategic? That is how RevOps becomes strategic. That's how you go from being a systems admin to a business partner that is relied upon to tell the business what's happening within the business. So with that, we're coming back to the RevOps bow tie, right? So hopefully you can see the kind of commonality from the beginning to the end here, but now we have defined that sort of MVP across all of these stages: the ICP, target personas, the target accounts, the target segments, the qualification framework and the process that sits around that, as well as the go-to-market processes and the reporting and analytics. And so again, it's really about providing visibility of your end-to-end customer journey and giving that ability to analyze, optimize, and drive efficiency as and when you need to do that.